Okay, hear me out. What do capybaras have to do with technology? The answer would be nothing if it weren't for the text game I'm about to make. The idea is simple. You have a minute until you turn into a capybara. This was all inspired by the recent capybara invasion in Argentina. Yes, this is real. Anyways, why text game? It's because I've worked with Twine before, it's free, open source, and can get painfully chaotic. Just like capybaras. How do you use Twine? It has an easy branching system using brackets. Let's say your player is buying groceries. You put brackets on the text option before making an error to the passage name. It creates passages for you if there's no passage for the name yet. And once you're done typing, you can see our two new passages here have been constructed. But that's easy. Yes, but that's all without macros. This is where coding comes into play with Twine. Macros are how Twine allows users to create variables, change text styles, and how text is displayed, and more using a hypertext coding language named Harlow. Shown here, this is the manual for some of the many macros available in Harlow. It's helpful for making cool additions like timers, inventories, and text transitions in your story. I'm going to learn a few basic macros and show how they turn out. I'm wanting to start with the font macro to show this line of text as a text message. The first thing I do is set up brackets around it to create the hook. This is what connects the macro to the appropriate line of text. Next, we just write font and then add in the text font that we want. Make sure to put quotation marks around the text font to make sure there isn't an error. After that, we can actually check to make sure that the font works correctly by exiting out of the passage and clicking play. Once we find the correct passage, we can see how the text message shows up differently than the rest of the text because of the font macro we used. The format for these kind of macros is pretty simple, where you just put like color or font and then quotation marks the appropriate thing to set it up with the hook. But let's say we want to do something a little bit more complicated, like a timer. Before I started in Twine, I decided to actually pull up Genie just to try out the coding and see what the kind of format would be like. It also gave me an idea of what variables and conditions I need to consider, like the fact that I would have to make sure it stops at 0 seconds to make sure it didn't run on forever. But this was just kind of like my trial run. First, we're going to make a story variable, which you can do by just adding a $sign to the variable name, and we're going to set it to 60, as in for 60 seconds. Then we'll make sure to display the amount of seconds left to the reader by adding a sentence that showcases the timer variable. It's important to set as a story variable because that way you can use it throughout the entire story. Next, we want to use live macro, which is a macro that changes according to the time duration you set it to. Now we can have timers subtract a second for every second that passes. And it refers to the leftmost variable, so we're going to use it in place of timer again. Now we're going to make an if statement where if timer is 0 seconds, then it goes to the final passage, capybara. And then we're going to make sure to replace the amount with the timer's value. So that way it won't just say like 60 seconds the whole time, but it'll actually start counting down. And as you can see, we can keep referencing timer the same way because it's a story variable. And now all we have to do is check to make sure that it's working properly. We just find the correct passage again, and then you can see the timer is working. It goes down for every second that passes. Okay, so now we know the basic format macros follow. It's always going to start with parentheses, the macro you're using, and then a colon followed by like a string or whatever variable you need to put next to it. That's just formatting for single macros. What if you want to combine macros to a single hook, or have one that changes colors, or anything like that? The next few macros will be simple, just like the font one we used earlier, but we'll focus more on how we could combine them and some different macro formats used. Let's go back to the text message we used the macro on earlier. Let's say we want to add a border, and we're just going to add the border macro. The border macro works kind of different than the usual format. It follows the same rules, except the border comes with the option to make 4 different sides, so you can use 4 strings in this case. There are different types of borders we can use, but we're just going to use solid for this one, so there'll be a solid border, like a box almost, around text. When we go check it in the passage, we see that there's an error, and you have to use a plus sign to actually combine the macros. You can't just put them side by side and have them work. The plus sign is kind of just a way for the hook to know that it has to use both macros, and when we go back to the text, we see that it's fixed and there's a border around it. However, the plus sign isn't the only way to combine multiple macros to one hook. Sometimes it just depends on the type of macro you use, and the one I'm about to show you is an example of this. So let's say you want a piece of text where when the reader interacts with it, it can change it to a different word or something. There's a macro we can use for that called click replace, where when you click it, it replaces whatever's in the quotation marks with the hook you add to it. For example, let's replace society with the environment when you click it. For this kind of macro, you don't actually have to use the plus sign to add more click replaces. You can just keep adding it on and just pair them up with each other, like this. It still follows a similar pattern to how the normal macro format works, except this time the hook is what ends up replacing the actual text. After that, if we want to go make sure that it's working properly, we can go find it, and we see that when we click society, it changes to an environment and it continues to cycle through. It's another cool macro to mess around with. Okay, so what did we learn? We learned about some basic macros and the concepts and rules behind them, as well as different ways to combine them to make cool just textual effects and transitions in your Twine story. The flexibility of Twine and the way Harlow works to integrate all these different things has made it a new and sort of upcoming platform that you've probably seen a lot of text games from. There's some really cool ones out there that I'll put in the link below, as well as some tutorials that will be down there, and there'll also be a link to the game I've made here down below as well. But yeah, Twine is cool, and so are capybaras.